global circulation of knowledge in empires, and a collection I contributed to, and which was out in 2023, if I remember. Yeah.
Yeah, that's correct.
Then he also edited two special issues on zoonosis and history of microbiology, in history of and philosophy of life sciences, and in medical anthropology in 2023 and 2024. And basically, his research is about the plague, but not only the plague. A lot of zoonosis that circulates in the world and mostly circulates along human circulation. Basically, this is the focus of his research. So the global perspective is a key part of his research because as the globalization of human society increased in the 19th century, also the diseases coming from this coming around circulating with this globalization increased. And so today we are here discussing the plague because his presentation will be titled When Infectious Disease Became Wild, Plague, Yellow Fever, and Disease Ecology in the Brazilian Hinterland, 1920-1975. So, Mateus, the floor is yours, and thank everybody for coming to the seminar. 45 minutes, Mateus, and then we have plenty of space for discussion and questions and so on. Okay, so thank you very much, Mateus.
Thank you. I will share my screen here. So just a second. So I hope you can see the presentation. I hope
yes,
you can also hear me. Okay, perfect. So first of all, thank you so much, Mauro, for this introduction, and also thank you so much for inviting me for this talk. It's a great pleasure to be here with you today. I hope it's also a beautiful day in Italy or wherever you are, because I'm here in Cambridge and it's such a beautiful sunny day here. So for today, my presentation will be partly related to my research at this postdoc at the University of St. Andrews, and also would like to share with you some ideas that I have for my next project that I hope will start by the end of this year. So I would like just to say that I changed a bit the time frame of these presentations. Instead of starting 1920, I will go back a little bit to 1899 because that's the beginning of the plague outbreaks in Brazil. So I would like to start this presentation with a more contemporaneous idea. So since the COVID-19 pandemic, we are very aware that most new disease, the so-called emerging infectious disease, they spill over from wild animals. And from wild animals, they can jump to domestic animals, they can jump to humans, and after this first jump, they will spread among humans. So that's the main idea of this paradigm of the emerging infectious disease, a paradigm that has emerged itself at the beginning of the 90s of the last century. And this has been central for all the current approach that we have of global health and One Health, the idea that wild animals, they harbor pathogenic virus and microorganisms, and from the wild animals, these pathogens, the pathogenic microorganisms, they can jump to humans, is central to all the actions against new pandemics, against new outbreaks. However, although this is important, is central, I don't want to criticize the idea of emerging infectious disease. I would also like to remind you that although we don't think too much about that, infectious disease, they don't only emerge from wild animals. They can also be conveyed. They can go back to animals. In other words, humans, they can also infect wild animals with infectious disease. This usually is called in English spillback, or sometimes reverse zoonosis. So you can see already in these two terms that is a very anthropocentric kind of approach, because it's always the idea that infectious disease are coming from the animals, and if humans they infect animals, it's because the disease are going back to that. And we have I just brought two examples here, but we can discuss more examples. We have deer infected with SARS-CoV-2 in North America, and we also have chimps and gorillas dying of common cold in Africa. So even if the disease doesn't kill too much, are not very a threat for humans, they can be a threat to animals. But because we don't think too much about the idea of a spillback, there's a sort of ignorance about what can happen when humans they infect animals, what can happen with these animals, but also what can happen with humans living close to these animals, because the virus, the microorganisms, they can mutate inside these animals and then spill over or spill back to the humans. So my idea today is to show a historical example where one disease was seen as spilling back or going or becoming wild. This happened with the plague, the bubonic plague, in Brazil throughout the 20th century. So in Brazil, plague was seen in the beginning of the century as an urban disease. But by the end of the 20th century, plague was framed as a disease of wild animals. So if we look at the history of plague in Brazil, we could see this sort of idea that plague, instead of coming from wild animals, became wild, became more entrenched in rural areas and among wild animals. So I must say that this is not unique of Brazil. In other countries, just to give you an example, South Africa, but also Argentina, we see a similar phenomenon of plague becoming wild, but Brazil has something almost unique. For two reasons. On the one hand, this sort of transformation of plague into a wild disease in Brazil took many decades, whereas in South Africa and in Argentina, but also in the United States, the idea that plague was a red white was much faster than in Brazil. And because of this sort of longue durée of plague becoming wild in Brazil, Brazil welcomed a series of scientific missions to study plague. And therefore, we have a huge mass of works about plague in Brazil made by Brazilians and also by foreign scholars, that they were interested in understanding how and why plague was moving towards rural and wild space. So as Mauro mentioned before, my research, I consider myself a global historian, but today I will show this process of globalization and how a new knowledge can be crafted into a global perspective, but just looking at Brazil. But my point will be, my argument is that if we look at the hinterland of Brazil and we follow all these actors, Brazilian and foreigners, who were there in Brazil studying plague, we can see the emergence of new knowledge about plague, and especially about plague ecology and disease ecology. So my argument is that new ideas about plague emerged in the Brazilian hinterland because of these interactions between Brazilians and scholars from other countries. So to explain this evolution of plague in Brazil, and at the same time, the evolution in the ways, by the ways that Brazilian and foreign scholars, they understood plague. In my presentation, I chose to divide this presentation in three phases. So these will be three historical moments that show a change in the way that plague was framed, in the way that plague was understood in Brazil. And the main difference between these phases will be which role was given to animals in the epidemiology of plague. And then how the place of these animals in the plague ecology change over time. So starting with the beginning of the history of plague in Brazil. So plague arrived in Brazil in 1899. This is the first years of the so-called third plague pandemic. So at the same moment that plague arrived in Rio de Janeiro and in Santos, plague also arrived in other ports of the world, from San Francisco to Cape Town, from Liverpool to Buenos Aires. In this first moment that plague arrived in Brazil, so it's the first moment that Brazil will register a plague outbreak, the way that the Brazilian authorities, they try to fight plague, it was in the first year of this fight against plague, it was somehow the same way that in other places of the world plague was understood. So in this first moment of plague in Brazil, the disease was linked to humans and to human-made objects. So the idea was that objects like cloth, leather, books, they could convey the plague bacillus that had been discovered just in 1894. And there was also the idea that humans, they could also transmit plague. That's why most of the actions against the sanitary actions against plague, they try to stop people and objects by moving around the oceans, and after plague arrived in Brazil, by moving around the main Brazilian cities. The main change in that sort of perspective about plague starts after Paul Louis Simon in India linked the plague to rats and fleas. So according to Simon, plague was not transmitted by humans or by objects, but actually it was the rat and the flea of the rat that transmitted the plague between rats and humans. So this idea was for the first time announced in 1898 in India. Brazilians, they knew about this idea since the moment that it was published, but there was some kind of cautious in adopting this theory as some kind of truth to face plague. Not because the Brazilians were resisting against some kind of modernity, but because the whole theory of Simon was very controversial, even in India, where it was for the first time elaborate, but also in Europe. So in Brazil, we see the same kind of hesitation to kill the rats as a measure to fight plague. This change in 1903, especially in the city of Rio de Janeiro, when a young doctor became the head of the Brazilian public health. So I should say that at that moment, in the beginning of the 20th century, the Brazilian public health is totally decentralized. So each state of Brazil had its own department of public health, and there was no national department of public health. There was a national department, but this department was only in charge of the city of Rio de Janeiro, which was the capital of Brazil. And this stayed like that until 1920. But in the city of Rio, where is the only space where the federal government has the power to fight infectious disease, and where the national government is in charge of the public health, There, in 1903, the president of the Brazilian Republic decided to put at the head of the public health a young doctor called Oswaldo Cruz, who after became a sort of hero of the Brazilian public health. He is the name of a main institution in Brazil, but his career starts by at this moment and at the fight against plague and yellow fever and smallpox in the city of Rio. So the idea of Oswaldo Cruz to fight plague was to keep the measures that had been used until that moment, so isolation of patients, vaccination, but he introduced a new measure, which was rat destruction. And this was made in Rio de Janeiro in a very funny way, I think. Instead of the government killing the animals, the Brazilian government decided to buy the rats destroyed by the population. So the idea was there was a sort of reward, a sort of small prize for people to kill the rats and sell these rats to the official rat catchers of the Brazilian government. So, and this cartoon here is a sort of joke about this sort of politics, because the cartoon makes fun with the idea that only the rats killed in Rio could be sold to the Brazilian government. So it means that a rat killed in another city nearby Rio, like the city of Niterói, which is just in front of, on the other side of the Guanabara Bay in Rio, could not be counted in these sorts of anti-plague measures. And then, therefore, to prove that the rat was from Rio, you should, in a way, give a sort of a birth certificate of the rat so you could get the money back from the Brazilian government. So there were a lot of scandals linked to this measure. There were some suggestions that people, instead of killing the rats, they were breeding rats inside their house, killing the rats and selling to the government. So in a way that would not stop the spread of plague, but actually that would increase the number of plague cases. But despite all these jokes and criticism, we know that officially, according to the official numbers, more than 2 million rats were killed in the period of 1903 to 1909. So that's the main moment of the plague outbreaks in Rio, and that's the main moment of the war against rats in Rio. We see politics like that in other parts of the world. So there were also these sorts of rat markets in Paris, in San Francisco, in Hanoi, in Vietnam. So Rio here is not different, but there is a main difference here in Rio, that we are talking about a very big city, a big city, more than 1 million people at that moment, and also a war against rats that took place for more than 1 year, because in these other cities that I mentioned, they stayed for 1 or 2 years, whereas in Rio, it really stopped in 1912. So we have 10 years of this fight against rats. By 1912, when this intense war against rats in Rio stopped, plague had declined in Rio. So in the beginning of the century, we have more than 300 deaths caused by plague and more than 2,000 cases of plague in Rio. By 1912, we only have 2 deaths by plague. So, and the idea was, and the argument of the Brazilian government was that because of the fight against rats, the plague case and deaths, they were reduced in Rio. So there was a construction of a correlation here. More rats destroyed, less case we had in Rio, fewer cases in Rio. Therefore, this was the proof that the rats were connected with the plague. But at that moment, it's not only the rats that is connected with plague, but also humans, and this idea that objects, they could also convey the plague. So here, the rat is part of the strategy against plague, but not the only part of this strategy. These start to change in 1920. So in the 20s, plague almost disappeared from the main cities of Brazil, from São Paulo, from Rio, from Santos, but plague moved apparently, in the opinion of the Brazilian scholars, plague had moved from the cities towards, so from the Atlantic cities towards cities that were in the middle of the country or a little bit far away from the coast. And also, in some case, plague had touched small cities and small villages in the Brazilian hinterlands. So just to give you one example, in 1927, 1926, 1927, there is an outbreak in a city called Triunfo, which is in the middle of the state of Pernambuco, which is in the northeast of Brazil. This city had 20,000 people. And in that outbreak, 1,000 people died. So we have here 5% of the population who died of plague. That's the biggest outbreak of plague in Brazil. So in the 20s, we have this sort of internalization of plague in Brazil, and this diagram here that I put in the slides shows this idea that plague is moving towards the hinterland. So from the ports is going to the hinterland. At the same time that we have this movement of plague from ports to the hinterland, the Brazilian public health is becoming more and more centralized. So in 1920, after the Spanish flu pandemic, the Brazilian government decided to create, for the first time, a national public health service. This was really national, but it didn't count the state of São Paulo, because this was the richest state, and this state had its own public health system and didn't want to be under the rule of the Brazilian National Service. But in 1930, there is a coup d'etat, a revolution in Brazil, led by Getúlio Vargas. And after this date, for the first time, the Brazilian government creates the Ministry of Health and Education. And after 1930, the public health in Brazil is centralized from the national government towards the states. So we have these two movements here: plague moving to the hinterland, centralization of the public health in Brazil, and we have a third event taking place at this moment, which is the discovery of the jungle yellow fever, or the sylvatic yellow fever. So I don't have too much time to explain the history of yellow fever, but the main point here is that in the beginning of the century, plague is not the main disease, the main infectious disease in the ports of Brazil. It's yellow fever. Yellow fever is a disease that brings all the efforts and all the attention of the Brazilian public health for many reasons, but especially because yellow fever apparently had, or they imagined that yellow fever usually killed the white migrants coming to Brazil, especially Italians and Portuguese and Spanish coming to Brazil. Usually they would die after arriving in Rio because of yellow fever. So there was a disease that needs to be controlled because it prevents white migration to Brazil. So for most of the time, at the beginning of the 20th century, yellow fever as plague was considered an urban disease, the disease of Rio and other ports. In 1929, yellow fever was, or they imagined, the Brazilian scholars imagined, it was eradicated from Brazil because no case of yellow fever was discovered in the main cities. But in 1932, yellow fever was discovered in the hinterland of Brazil, and it was discovered that yellow fever had a different ecology in the hinterland. Whereas in the cities, the yellow fever only exists if there was the yellow fever virus, a mosquito called Aedes aegypti, and humans. In the hinterland, it was discovered that yellow fever could exist without this mosquito. It means that other mosquitoes could transmit the yellow fever, and also that some animals could also catch the yellow fever, especially monkeys and marsupials. The discovery of the jungle yellow fever showed to the Brazilian scholars, but also to the Rockefeller Foundation in the United States, that it would be impossible to eradicate yellow fever from Brazil, because animals, wild animals, they could also get the yellow fever. So you could eradicate yellow fever from the cities, but not from the jungle and from the hinterlands. So we have these three dynamics happening at the same time. The discovery of jungle yellow fever, plague moving towards the hinterland, and the centralization of public health in Brazil. So in a way, at the crossroads of these three dynamics emerged some kind of question among the Brazilian scholars. What is spreading plague in the hinterlands? Is still the same epidemiology that we had in Rio? So it means that the rats, the fleas, and the humans are the only elements of this epidemiology, or do we have a different ecology of plague in the hinterlands, where and maybe other animals, especially wild rodents, are part of this ecology, as it's happening with the yellow fever. So to simplify my the question that these actors they were asking themselves, which animal is the plague reservoir in the Brazilian hinterland? Is it the rat, as in the city of Rio, or is it another animal? So by the end of the 30s in Brazil, there is this sort of controversy. Some Brazilian doctors, they think the plague epidemiology in the hinterland is exactly the same as that was in Rio, just in a different setting. Other actors will argue that no, some wild rodents, especially one rodent called Preá, is in charge of spreading plague in the hinterland. So it's in these moments of doubts and of controversies in Brazil that the Brazilian government decides to invite a foreign scholar, a plague expert from Chile, to try to solve this controversy. His name is Attilio Maquiavelo. So he was Attila and Machiavelli in the same person. And I hope the Italians will appreciate this joke. And he arrives in Brazil. He stays 1 year in this area that we have in Brazil called, in Portuguese, o sertão, which is usually translated in English as the backlands, where plague was the main that's the main hotspot of plague in that moment. And after 2 years there, where he interacts with Brazilian doctors, where he visits farms and ranches, and he visits this huge area of Brazil that corresponds to is 3 times bigger than Germany, Maquiavelo, he arrives to the conclusion that in the backlands, we have the same epidemiology that we have in, for example, in Rio, that the rats are the plague reservoir. And that because rats, they can move from one ranch to the other, where they convey plague to humans. And why they are moving like that is because the backlands is a semi-desert. So it's a dry place. So the rats need to be constantly moving around this huge area to try to find food. And where they are doing that, they bring plague to the ranchers and to the farmers. And this Maquiavelo calls peste rural, so the rural plague. So here we have what I call a sort of rat hegemony. So it's the rat that is in the center of the plague ecology in Brazil. The Brazilian government accepts the idea of Maquiavelo and use this as a justification to change the structure of the fight against plague in Brazil. And in 1941, the Brazilian government creates the Serviço Nacional de Peste, so the Plague National Service. Other services were created at the same time. There is also a national service against yellow fever, for example. So here we have the idea that to fight plague is necessary to have a national fight against that. And you have here the photo of this plague service. And if you look attentively, they look like colonial officers, English soldiers going to Africa. But actually, these guys, they are Brazilian, and they are sanitary guards in charge of fighting plague in the Brazilian backlands. So if you look here, for example, this is a kind of a flamethrower. So they would use these sorts of machines to destroy the rat burrows inside farms and the house. So the Plague National Service had two goals. On the one hand, control the plague outbreaks in the Brazilian hinterland, especially in the Brazilian backlands, but also to avoid plague going to wild rodents, what they call the sylvatic plague. So the idea here was to control something and avoid something else, which was the idea that plague could jump to wild rodents. And why it was so important to avoid this? Because in the mind of the Brazilian scholars and the Brazilian politicians, if plague jumped to wild rodents, therefore it would be impossible to eradicate plague, because plague would become entrenched among wild animals, as happened with the yellow fever. So to avoid this, it was necessary to destroy rats, to change the house of the peasants, to rat-proof this house, and also to destroy natural fence that exists between rural and wild space. All around the backlands, these natural fence, which were made of vegetation, were destroyed by the Brazilian government because the Brazilian doctors understood this natural fence as a place where wild rodents and rats, they would meet. So it was a sort of a frontier, a border between the rural and the wild space that needs to be destroyed. So until 1950, that was the main the main strategy against plague, which I call this sort of rat hegemony. But in the 50s, this started to change because there were some cracks in this sort of paradigm, that the rat was the center of the plague epidemiology, and it was necessary to kill these rats, and by killing the rats, we could avoid, we could control plague. Because plague was not controlled in Brazil in the 50s. Despite these huge actions, these huge fights against plague in the Brazilian hinterland, plague still survived in a few hotspots. It's true that the Brazilian government managed to reduce the area of plague case, to reduce the number of cases, but until the 50s, the Brazilian government had been unable to eradicate or almost suppress plague from the Brazilian hinterland. So because of this incapacity of eradicate plague in Brazil, some Brazilian doctors started to point out that maybe it was necessary to reevaluate the ideas behind the fight against plague in Brazil, because maybe some other animals were also linked to the plague epidemiology, and especially rodents. And this idea that rodents could be other rodents, no, rats are also rodents, but what I mean by here is wild rodents. They were connected with plague, justified from 1951 to 1955 a huge collection of wild rodents in the Brazilian backlands. And we know that more than 60,000 wild rodents were killed, taxidermized, and sent to Rio de Janeiro, where they are still there in the National Museum. So the National Museum was destroyed by a fire in 2018, but the rat collection survived. As good rats, they managed to survive, and they are still there because they were in a different building. And this is a photo I took 2 years ago. So this shows to us the magnitude of this fight against nature in Brazil at that moment, and the magnitude of the fight against plague. Because imagine if we have 60,000 taxidermized rodents, how many animals were in the end killed? If this is 10% of the animals that were killed, it means that 600,000 were killed. But maybe it's not. I think it's just 1% that they managed to taxidermize. But Because of this huge fight against wild rodents, or this destruction of wild rodents, this allows Brazilian scholars to start studying these animals, to start studying the ecological relations that they had with domestic rats, and to start thinking that maybe these animals were the real reservoir of plague and not the rats. But until the 60s, until the end of the 50s, sorry, there is still a lot of debates, and no one is sure what is the final answer of what is the reservoir of plague in Brazil. So again, to solve this problem, in 1957, the Brazilian government invites another plague scholar, this time an Argentinian scholar called José María de la Barrera, who was a plague expert in Argentina and who in Argentina had proved that wild rodents were the plague reservoir in Argentina. So de la Barrera, he goes to Brazil. He goes again to the Brazilian backlands. He stays 1 year there, visiting the same place that Maquiavelo had visited. He also interacts with Brazilian doctors, peasants, hunters, and after 1 year, he writes a report that was never published, actually, but he writes this report. And that's the first time that we have, as a kind of official conclusion, that actually the rats were not the reservoir of plague in Brazil. It was a series of wild rodents, especially 3 of them. Punaré, which is that animal that so this rodent here, mocós, and preais. And also a 4th one called rato pichuna. So they were the plague reservoir in the backlands. Because according to de la Barrera, that's the only way to explain why plague remained in the Brazilian hinterland despite the destruction of rats. And also it was the only way to explain why you could have plague outbreaks among humans without rats dying of plague, but we could have wild rodents dying of plague. And his explanation of why it's in that area of Brazil that we have the plague, why not in other areas of Brazil, but only in that area of Brazil that plague is entrenched among these wild rodents, is again because of the environment of the Brazilian backlands. It's because it's this sort of kind of a semi-desert. So when you have the dry season, the wild rodents, they need to approach the human house to find food. And when they approach the house, either they infect the humans or they infect rats, and the rats, they will infect humans. So he changed the explanation for the ecology of plague. So according to him, the rats are the wild rodents are the reservoir of plague in Brazil. But despite the publication of his, after he writes this report, the Brazilian government and most of the Brazilian plague experts, they don't accept this idea immediately. They ask for more studies, for more research, and from the beginning of the 60s until 1975, the Brazilian government decided to create its last program of plague research, called Programa Piloto de Peste, in the city of Exu, which is in the state of Pernambuco. This program for plague studies is a kind of a joint is a collaboration between Brazilian scholars and the Pasteur Institute, and the leader of this program is a French scholar called Marcel Balthazar, who was a plague expert and who had studied plague in Iran. After the studies of Balthazar, and the studies conducted by Balthazar, they are different from the others because the other scholars, they always start by the rats And from the rats, they try to understand the relations between the rats and the wild rodents. Whereas in the case of this last program of research in Brazil, it was the opposite. They start studying the wild rodents, not the rats, but studying the wild rodents. And then they reach this conclusion that, and again, they say the same thing that De La Barrera said, but now with more results, with a more substantial kind of data, that the Programa Piloto concludes that, in fact, plague had become entrenched among wild rodents, and from the wild rodents, it was jumping back to humans. So the wild rodents are the plague reservoir, and that's still the main official, that's the official position of the Brazilian government until today. So if you ask the Brazilian government, the Minister of Health in Brazil, what is the reservoir of plague in Brazil, they will say wild rodents, especially Punaré, Mocó, and Rato Pichon. So after 75, the controversies, in a way, they are resolved. And the idea that actually is this pool of wild rodents is among this pool of wild rodents that where the plague bacillus circulates, and from where they jump to domestic rats, and they can jump to humans, although the last case of plague in Brazil dates from 2005. So we are almost 20 years without any plague case. And the last death by plague in Brazil is from 1985. So almost 40 years without any death. So since the idea that the wild rodents, they are the main reservoir of plague in Brazil, the fight against plague was partially modified. So until the 80s, most of the action was still to kill rats and also to turn to rat-proof house and other buildings. But since then, the strategy against plague has also included the surveillance of wild rodents, which means that the Brazilian government from time to time will catch sanitary guards working for the Brazilian government will catch wild rodents and test to see if these animals are infected with plague or not. If they are infected, then some actions will be taken in that area. For example, some animals will be killed, the population can be vaccinated against plague. And more recently, the strategy that is adopted is to test dogs, to see if dogs they have antibodies against plague. Because if dogs they have antibodies against plague, it means that these dogs they are in contact with wild rodents who have the plague. So it's so the dogs they became in the 90s a sort of sentinel against plague in Brazil. So to conclude my talk, I hope to have shown like how in the 20th century plague became progressively associated and framed as a disease of rural space and of wild animals. But my point is not there was a biological or a natural phenomenon here of plague moving towards wild animals, but also these cannot be disconnected of epistemological transformation that in the way that the Brazilian scholars they will frame the plague. So if in the beginning of the century they framed plague as a disease of humans and rats, or conveyed by humans and rats, if after the 20s they are convinced that plague is exclusively a disease of rats, and from rats it can jump to humans, after the 50s, but especially after 75, plague was framed as a disease of wild rodents. So we can see here also a kind of a scientific and epistemological transformation here. And if we take this transformation as a continuum, we can see that there is a complexification of the ecology of plague. The ecology of plague, in other words, the ecological relations that can explain why plague circulates and thrives in Brazil became more and more complex in the sense that more elements were included in this ecology. So if in the beginning of the century we have just maybe 2 or 3 elements, humans, rats, and fleas, and some objects, by the end of this process, we have a plethora of wild rodents. We have a plethora of parasites of these animals, like fleas, that jump from one animal to the other. We have the rats, and we have the humans. So there is a complexification of the plague ecology, which suggests that the studies of plague in Brazil, they can be a clue to understand the emergence of a sort of framework that is still the framework that we use today, called disease ecology, in Brazil. So I'm not saying that only the studies of plague, but the studies of plague in Brazil, this transformation of plague from a urban disease to a wild disease in Brazil, it, in a way, showcase not only that the ecology of plague became complex, but that the understanding about disease ecology became a framework used by Brazilian scholars to explain the epidemiology of a disease like plague. Thank you very much. I can hear you.
Okay, yeah.
Okay, now
Thank you very much, Mateus, for this really interesting talk and all this long discussion of the circulation of blood between humans and animals and different kind of animals and the and concepts. So I just before leaving the space for discussion, I have my own question, my own very short question at the beginning is why did they taxidermize all those wild rodents? You know, they were dead, they didn't have any parasites. You know, why keep them like that in the National Museum? So it's really a matter of practice or just showing off that they were doing something or something like that. So I really don't understand the reason for that.
No, thank you very much, and and this allows me to explain more about this collection, because I would like really to study this collection as an archive, because each animal has a sort of kind of identification. So we have 60,000 animals and 60,000 small slips where we can see from where the animal was collected, who collected, and why. So it's also a way to show the voice and the names of these actors that are not the main experts, because they were sanitary guards and collectors, so usually from the rural population. So we have these two archives linked to these collections. So the animals and the written material. But why they were taxidermized and they were kept, they are still there, because there were two purposes here. One was to study plague, and the other was to study animal ecology, not disease ecology, but animal ecology, and to study rodent ecology in the Brazilian hinterland. And to do this sort of work, you need a series of animals, which is different from a sort of the paradigm of the natural history. So if we think about the natural history, if we think about the museums in Europe in the 19th century, usually it was 1 or 2 specimens that were collected because it was just to showcase, this is I don't know, this is a dodo, this is a whale, and so on. Whereas here, the idea is really to show the number of animals in a given area, and also to understand the relations, the ecological relations of these animals, the size of the animals, the sex of the animals. So it's a more kind of a populational work than just natural history work. So that's why they want to kept. They are still studying this collection until today. They use this collection to understand how these animals their behavior and so on. But there was also another idea of using these animals as a piece of trade, to trade these animals with, let's say, a museum in the United States, a museum in Argentina, and they did. They used these animals as a sort of exchange object. So there were these two. Yes, I can see someone put in the comment that that's a huge collection. That's the biggest collection of wild rodents in South America. Maybe one of the biggest in the world, but that's the biggest in South America. So it's huge.
Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for this clarification. And so, open for questions. Anybody has comments or questions about? Okay, so I didn't see who was first, so Leticia or Anastasia. It's Leticia? No, Anastasia. No, okay, Anastasia then. So, Anastasia?
Okay, thank you. Because I'd like to continue this discussion about collection, because 60,000, it's still huge collection, even for what you explained. It's usually like few hundred for every species. So what make it? So 60,000 of how many species of these rodents?
Okay, so first of all, I need to say that I was in Brazil in December, and I visited again the museum, and I had 2 hours of I met the curator of this collection. His name is João Alves de Oliveira, very nice guy. And we were discussing about these numbers, and he was very frank. He said, like, I still don't understand why they collect so many animals. It's huge, and now he's in charge of that. He needs to preserve these animals, and he's also astonished by the number of these. And what is more fascinating is, like, despite in collect 60,000 rodents, the scholars at the the National Museum in the 50s, they didn't publish anything about these rodents. So during 30 years, this was forgotten, and this was really recovered after this curator arrived in the museum. We have the studies about plague, but not about what I'm talking about, the population and the ecology of these animals. So the number of species. So I can send to you the description of this catalog. Unfortunately, it's in Portuguese. So I can't remember now the number of species, but I would say that something around 20 species.
It's still very huge collection. And when I talk with curators of some collections, and they usually said that you either publishing, either you keeper of collection, you can do both. Either you are care about your collection, either you produce papers. So I'm not surprised that it was not published anything, some papers when it was collecting. So it's pretty usual, especially for the mid 20th century.
And there's just one. Sorry. Now, I'll just say that there is a more kind of anecdotal thing, is like the person who was in charge of constructing this collection. His name is João Mugin. So it's the same name of the curator. They have the same first name, João, which is a very common name in Brazil. So João Mugin, he was the main Brazilian expert in wild rodents, and he was in charge of that. But in 1955, he was hired by the Brazilian government to help to construct the new capital of Brazil. So he was in charge of the new University of Brasilia. So he left the National Museum and he moved to the new capital. So there is a kind of institutional kind of discontinuity here that in a way explain why this collection was so big, but the guy didn't have the time to study this because he moved to another place and the collection stayed in Rio de Janeiro.
Thank you.
If nobody else, any other question, I do have. No, Leticia, yeah, sorry, I didn't see your hands raised again, so go on.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mateus, it's thrilling to attend to watch such a careful study you made and with a very long historical period of time in which you send very clearly the message that Rio, rural, metropolis, and jungle are the localities of these things, and human rats and so on as ecological, let's say, vectors of this disease. So it's a very careful and wonderful way of showing what you correctly summarize as a framework of disease ecology and a great change in epistemology. As you are very well aware, plagues and diseases were a very important part of the nation-state building process in Brazil in this whole period. You are very aware of it. And during, let's say, the first part of this period, there is this effort from the federal government to transform Brazil in a federation. And some states resisted. The Ministry of Health and Education and so on resisted the government, also in terms of choices in health issues. And you mentioned the São Paulo state, which is the most important example in this way. But since you covered such a territorial aspect, including jungles and so on, during your research, did you come on other examples of resistance or of decentralized initiatives in parts of Brazil different from let's say, the avant-garde thing that was promised from the central government? So thank you very much and super congratulations.
Thank you very much, Letícia. So first of all, I would like to say a few words about the idea of the nation building, no, because I think this is the kind of the sort of leitmotif.
I shouldn't have said a nation. I should have said just a state building, but you are quite right. Thank you so very much.
No, but state building, also nation building. I think this is really like the kind of red line that connect the red thread that connects all this research about Brazil, because we can see this very well, like how it and how disease and medicine and health, they became a tool to, in a way, to construct this idea of nation and a Brazilian state as well at the same time. And I think it's also interesting because we could also see some kind of from the cities to the hinterland in this sort of approach, because in the beginning of the century, the nation is seen from Rio and from São Paulo, and the main focus is really these cities. But then, I mean, after after Canudos, but also after other rebellions in the backlands and in the hinterland, the idea that it's necessary to civilize the hinterland of Brazil, to integrate these areas to Brazil, became central. And one way of integrating and civilizing is to sanitize the hinterland of Brazil. And then, which also allows me to answer one question that maybe someone would ask, right, is why so much money put to fight plague, if in the end plague was not the main disease, the main infectious disease in Brazil? by far. Like even the beginning of the century, the main disease is tuberculosis. That's a disease that kills the most of the people in Rio de Janeiro. But then comes yellow fever. But then when we look at the hinterland, malaria, Chagas disease, and a lot of disease linked to worms, those are the diseases that kill people a lot. But when we compare, actually there were more money for plague than for other disease. Why? And I think here is really this kind of idea about what Brazil should be. What does it mean to be modern? And in the perception of the Brazilian politicians, to have plague in the hinterland is a proof that we are backwards, or the hinterland is backwards. So therefore, so much investment to defeat a disease that in the end is not the most important in a very pragmatic way in the number of cases and the number of deaths. So for me, there is this idea, there's a kind of a symbolic point here that in a way also justifies or has justified the fight against plague in Brazil, and is totally connected with this idea of the nation and the state building of Brazil. And then comes the second part of your question of some kind of resistance, or maybe I would say there were also moments in which decentralization goes one step back. The decentralization is not linear and is not the ultimate thing that is going to happen. Because if we look, I forgot to mention this, but after 1956, the Plague National Service is replaced by something called the Departamento Nacional de Endemias Rurais, so the National Department of Rural Endemics. And after that moment, there is still some kind of a centralization, but there is a sort of also decentralization here again, in which, at least for the case of plague, but also for other diseases, but in the case of plague, the fight against plague is no longer national. It became again very pinpoint in the last hotspots of plague in Brazil. And then comes the moment of the Brazilian dictatorship after 1964, where also these it was a very centralized state, but in the case of the fight against plague, this was again reduced and scattered around in much more in a more local than national. So I think here we also have this example of this. The centralization is not, it was not the ultimate thing, but it also, in moments, we also had decentralizations happening at the same time, or just after process of centralization.
Thank you so very much.
So, Lavinia, your turn.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I wanted to say I am an early modernist, so please forgive me if my question is not like very well crafted. In your narrative, and you mentioned like in the last while you were replying to the last question, you mentioned the question of modernization. So these made me think about another history of modernization in contemporary medicine and ecology, that is the history of DDT. And it was reminded to me when you mentioned the question of malaria. So I was wondering whether you saw some intersections between these two diseases and like technologies of policing spaces that kind of conflate together or become like opposed. And in that sense, I also wanted to ask you about whether the Brazilian government was producing videos, for example, because in the case of DDT, we have lots of like propaganda videos from Italy to the United States, like the Navy of the United States in the 1940s, 1950s. So I was wondering whether there was something similar for this kind of interventions against the plague. And I was also very curious about whether you use or you plan to use oral histories as part of your future research concerning these practices. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lavinia. I will start by the second question about the videos. I would love to find these videos. I never found. I tried, which is fascinating because we also have in Brazil videos, for example, about the fight against yellow fever, made actually in the beginning of the century, but we also have in the hinterland. But so there was a huge tradition of creating movies, sort of public health movies. Some made by the French scholars visiting Brazil, some made by the Brazilian government, and other videos made by the Rockefeller Foundation. In the case of plague, I never found it. Maybe they exist. I'm just saying that I never came across. On the other hand, we have a huge collection of photos, of and also of maps of linked to the history of plague in the hinterland. And these maps are amazing. They look like a petri dish. It's a circle. There was pinpoints in a farm, and then there is a map of all the farms and ranches that exist around that area in where case of plague and death were found. So we have a huge visual documentation about plague, but I never found videos about that. But perhaps they exist, but I never found. About the DDT. Yes, so one of the measures of the Plague National Service was to use DDT against plague, because the idea was that the DDT would kill the fleas. So although the rat, they could stay contaminated with plague, if you don't have the flea to transmit the plague from the rats to the humans, you can control plague. So you don't eradicate plague, but you, in a way, eradicate the fleas. So therefore, you don't have the transmission. And because of the use of DDT, I mean, this is one of the factors that will make some scholars like De La Barrera to say that that's why plague only exists among the wild rodents, because the Brazilian government, the sanitary guards, they were not spraying DDT among the wild rodents. They were only spraying the DDT among rats. Rats were living close to the house, therefore they could find these rats. So that's why this could be also one of the explanations why plague became entrenched among wild rodents, is because it's only among these animals that the fleas and other parasites or the fleas, they could exist, because the DDT eradicates plague close to, eradicate fleas close to the house. So yeah, so there is a huge connection here, and it's the northeast of Brazil is one of the places where malaria is the very malarial place of Brazil, and one of the first areas in Brazil where DDT was used. So there is here a connection between malaria and plague, as you notice, and you had this insight, which is perfect, and this is really part of the actions against plague. The oral history. This is always for me a problem. For the reason that most of these actions against plague, they took place in the 50s and the 60s in Brazil. So we are talking about something that happened 60, almost 70 years ago. So to find most of the doctors who were in charge of that, they are dead. But the person who is in charge of the Plague National Surveillance, her name is Alzira de Almeida, the only woman who was part of this research. She joined the research about plague when she was 24, and now she's 82. So I stayed 2 weeks with her the last time I went to Brazil. But for the rural populations, first you have a problem that you can find a doctor like that, but you cannot find a peasant so easily. No, they don't have a a CV, so that you can contact them. Most of these people, they are dead because the life expectancy in Brazil, in the hinterland, in the 50s was 40 years. So it would be, we can find with there is someone who wrote a thesis about some kind of the souvenirs, the memories of her grandma, who is dead by now, but who was a child in the 50s. So, but what I want to do with my future research is to use material produced by the peasants, because we have interviews with the peasants that were published in newspapers, peasants affected by plague, or who were complaining about the fact that the Brazilian government destroyed their house, or they were spraying DDT and killing also, and or killing the rats, but also killing other animals that were useful for them. So we have material produced by the peasants, like interviews. I have found already these letters where they complain about these the measures, and we also have these material that I was talking about while I was answering to Mauro, that of these sorts of documents that they go with the rodents, because these documents, they were also filled out by members of the rural populations, because they were in charge of catching the rats. So we have material produced by them, and my idea would be, but also to use the tools of the cultural history and of the micro history, and also looking at the experts who were sent to the same region of Brazil during more than 30 years, and looking at them as a sort of anthropologists, a sort of ethnographers, as Ginsburg joked about, that we could look at the inquisitor also as a kind of anthropologist. So why not to do the same thing with these experts who were there and who were talking about the peasants? So my idea for the future would be to use the material produced by the peasants, but also to read the reports against their grain, and to try to grasp the ways of life of these rural populations, and how they were changing because of the fighting against plague. Like, did they change the way that they interact with wild rodents? Because some of these rodents, they were part of their diets. They hunt these animals and they eat them. So did they change these behaviors because now the rodents were the reservoir of plague or not? So this will be central for my future research. So thank you very much.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for elaborating.
Matheus, I do have another question. Is there some kind of genealogy between practical or epistemical or whatever between this wild plug research and zoonosis research and contemporary One Health, in terms of, I don't know, ideas that directly passes from one to another, or people, individuals, or practices, institutions, or something like that? I don't know. I really don't know anything about the history of One Health, and so I was wondering whether it's kind of current fashion or something that actually is more a deep embedded current in animal epidemiology, and then came up to to disease ecology, and then came to contemporary One Health.
Okay, this is a very good and complex question, and this is also central for my next research, which is a kind of a critical analysis of the idea of emerging infectious disease and One Health. But reading this from the Global South and from these studies of disease jumping to animals, and not only jumping from animals. But to give you an example from the Global North, if we follow Mark Honigsbaum and other researchers who wrote about disease ecology, the idea of disease ecology is linked to the history of plague, because Charles Elton, who is the father of modern ecology and who is the first to really articulate more or less this idea of disease ecology, he has a classic study about plague among white animals, and he thinks that plague is a natural thing among white animals, that plague could regulate the rodent population. So in some areas of Mongolia, you have outbreaks there of plague, so as a way to regulate. That's his kind of idea. We also have Carl Mayer in California, who, according to Mark Honigswald, is also another father of disease ecology, who was very active in the 30s and the 40s and died in, I think, in the 60s. This guy, one of the focus of his research is the Sylvatic plague. Actually, he is the actor who translate this word into English, because the Sylvatic plague, the idea of Sylvatic plague, was invented by a Portuguese. His name is Ricardo Jorge. But he creates this concept in French, La peste sylvatique, and when translated into English, it became Sylvatic plague. And the guy who did that is Carl Mayer, who was in California and who is one of the fathers of disease ecology. But in all of these cases, Mayer, Elton, and many others in the global north, or the so-called global north, they imagined that animals were the source of zoonosis and of disease. Actually, Carl Mayer, he has an article that is The Animal Kingdom, a Reservoir of Human Disease, a classic thing that he wrote in 1942, if I'm not mistaken. So what my point is, okay, there is this genealogy here from the United States, from Britain. But if we move to the focus to the global south, if we move the focus, in my case, to Brazil, we see a different, not necessarily a genealogy, but we see a different group of actors study the same kind of object, in this case plague, but suggesting some kind of a different answer. Not only the animals are the reservoir, but they could become, because of human actions, of the conquest of the hinterland by settlers and so on. So, and my point here is, I don't know if the Brazilian or the South American who were studying plague also in Brazil, if they are behind the idea of emerging infectious disease, but my point is that looking at them, we can see a different story unfolding, which could bring to a different genealogy. So I don't think they are too connected with that, but the guys in the global north studying plague, they are for sure connected to the idea of disease ecology, as we have until today.
So, you know, when One Health is created, like I'd say 20 years ago, something like that,
Yeah, more or less. Yeah.
more or less. Do we have, you know, do they refer to these kind of things like having some kind of historical consciousness, or it was just like, okay, now we have to face these threats from these new threats, actually something like completely new, because this is what is sold now. Like the marketing of One Health is something new. Now we are aware of these disease ecology, of the fact that we interact in different ways with the animal world, and blah blah blah. So they are starting also to thinking about man-made phenomena, like for example antimicrobial resistance in cattle, and you know, all these things all collapse into this new research field of One Health, getting a lot of money and new buzzwords in World Health Organization and global institutions, something like that. Do they have some, you know, are they conscious of that they're not really discovering the phenomenon because a lot of people studied it with the same, actually, basically the same available means as they are now. Of course, modernization is something else, but you know, they were doing the same work 50 years ago, 40 years ago, and then 30 years ago, and maybe even 50 years ago. Do they recognize this kind of genealogy? Do you think? Have you seen have you seen these?
Yeah, so I'm not. I don't consider myself a historian of the One Health. So of the emergence of the idea of One Health. I think mine, but this is a kind of impressionist kind of opinion. I think they relate more to the idea of emerging infectious disease that emerged as such in 1992, 1993 in the United States. And these guys who were in charge of creating this paradigm, they were aware that these studies were happening before. But my impression is that with the emerging infectious disease, they turn the thing upside down. Because for Karl Mayer, for all these actors that I mentioned, they don't think that new diseases are emerging, but these diseases were already there. Whereas with the idea of emerging disease, there is a kind of a potentiality that new things will emerge that we still don't know. But they will have the same kind of approach in this sense of the diseases are emerging because of environmental change, of change in the patterns of tourism, of the circulation of people. Globalization is a problem also behind these patterns of emerging infectious disease. This is in the 90s. So if there is a kind of a genealogy, I would say, is this genealogy between One Health and emerging infectious disease. But I'm not sure, I'm not sure, if the guys that were in charge of the One Health, they were conscious of all this research that had been carried, even in the United States, since the beginning of the 20th century about disease ecology. I don't know. What I think they were aware, of course, because they integrate this idea of emerging infectious disease inside their own kind of scope. So.
Thank you. And Anastasia?
Thank you. I'd like to continue with this One Health idea. And it happens that I look through veterinarian journals for the late 19th, early 20th century, and they discuss a lot of question if tuberculosis of people is more or less the same that tuberculosis of cattle. If cattle could catch human tuberculosis, and the same with helminths. So this idea in general is pretty old. So at least not for wild animals, but for veterinarians, anthrax, of course, which is dangerous both for people and animals. We discuss it with Anna Mazanik. You probably know her works. She writes about encephalitis and tick-borne disease. So probably there were not this term One Health, but the idea was in the air, at least for people who were doing something with animals. That's my point.
No, and I agree, and I think like when we look at the history of zoonosis, the term zoonosis emerged at the end of the 19th century. It's Virchow who creates this concept, and you have this idea of disease for him, no, moving from domestic or domesticate animals to humans, but the idea that humans could catch disease from animals, and it could be a circulation of that, is also with Pasteur. If we think about rabies, this also is part of the debate there, which I think in this case of plague which is interesting, is that it's not too many about domesticate animals and the animals in the farms, for example, but is this is the setting is the rural space, but you have here is more about the wild animals. But as I said in the beginning, Brazil is not the only case. Like South Africa is also a good example. Actually, all the debates about plague moving towards wild animals, wild rodents, is really a South African research in the beginning of the 20th century. This gives place to the concept of veld plague, the plague in the veld, which the idea of sylvatic plague is just a kind of universalization of this concept. And my friend and colleague Judith Scott Nesbrow has wrote about the veld plague. So yeah, we have in these different contexts this idea that diseases are jumping from humans to animals. So, and I think when we look to this, in a way, is a little bit more complex than sometimes the One Health, because here there is an acknowledgement. It's not one vector. It's not only from animals to humans, but it was. I'm not one to romanticize the past, but it's just like to say that there was here a sort of complexification here. They were aware of this complexification. I think it's interesting to show and to make sense of this complexification.
Okay, we are you're just in time for closing this session of our seminar series, and thank you very much for everybody for coming. Thank you very much, Mateusz, for your presentation and all your answers to this very demanding public. And so really, thank you very much, everybody. And I just want to remind you that the next meeting will be on the 27th of May, always 4:30 Central European Time. And we're going to have Duygu Yildirim, which is going to talk about From Tunis to Florence, Materiality, Everyday Encounter, and the Limits of Knowledge. We don't have a specific time frame for this workshop, or at least I don't know exactly. Maybe Lavinia knows. Early modern.
Yeah, 16.
Okay, early modern. So I hope to see you again on the 27th of May in 1 month. And thank you very much, everybody, for coming and participating in this seminar.
Thank you so much for the
to
invitation.
the Italian Society for the History of Science for hosting us. Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Matheus.
Parabéns, Matheus. Arrivederci. Bye bye.
Obrigado, tchau.
Bye, bye.
Parabéns. Bye bye.